So today I'm here to talk about how colonialism made Africans dependent on the Europeans. How did colonialism make Africans dependent on Europeans? It is very, very evident today in the African climate, African atmosphere, that Africans are very much dependent on the Europeans on virtually every single thing that they do consume. Ali Mazrui, who is late today, the legendary historian, said that Africans produce what they do not consume and consume what they do not produce. Today, virtually everything Africa consumes is being produced by the Europeans and imported. But then the question that we should ask is, now, these things that are oftentimes being imported into Africa, are Africans not capable of producing these things? That is the big question. Of course, Africans are capable, because when we study the pre-colonial and pre-slavery Africa, we would realize that Africans were producers of most of the things of which they did consume, until when they came in contact with Europeans, they finally now experienced what Europeans came to create as a dependency economy. And so after colonialism, African industries which were evident or which were existing had been banned or were no longer in existence. So how did it happen? It is very important to know how certain things happen, for when we know how they did happen, we would now be able to understand how we got to where we are and then find the solution, because now we can now retrace our steps back to where we once were. So how did it happen? First of all, ask yourself a question. Did Africans have existing industries prior to the coming of the Europeans? Of course, yes, they did have. And then these industries that Africans had, what happened to these industries after Europeans came? Now, it is important to understand that when the Europeans came, the first thing they did was that they abolished the industries that were existing in Africa. Local industries were banned. Now, the question is, why were they banned? I'm asking this question so that you can follow me well and understand why and how these things happened. Now, it is important to remember that slavery once happened. Slavery took place from around 15th century and then declined around 19th century when the abolition came. I explained why the abolition came and certain reasons that led to it in my previous video. Now, with slavery happening, part of the reason why I explained that the abolition ended was Industrial Revolution. Now, what is Industrial Revolution like I explained? It was the period where the Europeans moved from manual usage or manual labor to machineries. And so now, when the Europeans had already gotten the machines, on getting these machines now, they needed raw materials. I explained that after they made these machines, they needed raw materials, hence the need why after slavery, it wasn't colonialism, but what we got was legitimate commerce, of which I often ask how legit was the legitimate commerce. And so I explained to say that during this legitimate commerce, a legitimate commerce now involved where Europeans were now importing raw materials from Africa back then to their industries where they needed it. So now, with colonialism coming into picture, colonialism involved where the Europeans now did not want to continue dealing in the legitimate commerce that involved African middlemen, but this time they wanted to come into Africa and get the raw materials by themselves so that they can use it for their industries. And so on coming into Africa, taking Africa forcefully due to the scramble of Africa that happened between 1884 and 1885 in Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, they got into Africa, having split Africa among themselves. They now took over the different territories that they claimed belonged to them, and they began to do the necessary. So now what happened? They now first of all got rid of any competition, and the competition first of all was the local industries. Our local industries in Africa were known to produce most of the things of which Africans consumed. But when the Europeans came, they banned these industries. Why? First of all, they needed labor. Labor for what? Labor for the raw materials that they needed. Secondly, they needed these raw materials for their foreign industries, which meant that after the African labor produces these raw materials, they can now take these raw materials back then to Europe and they use it for their machines, convert it to the finished goods, and then bring back these finished goods back to Africa so that Africa now can no longer produce what it wants, but rather consume what the Europeans have already made from their industries. And so one of the first things they did was that they banned the local industries. That was one thing they did. Now, banning the local industries would not just subject people to European rule. And so they now put certain structures in place that made it possible to make it happen. Now, remember now I said they brought in wage labor. Now, to bring in wage labor, it meant that now people had to be paid in a certain currency. Remember, pre-colonial Africa did not have currency. The way we did our dealings were through trade by barter. And so now the Europeans introduced currency. With introducing currency and wage labor side by side, it was necessary that people now had to engage in wage labor in order for them to get the currency. But that wasn't enough to actually subject Africans to the wage labor. Now something came into the picture. And what came into the picture was taxation. With taxation coming into picture, forceful taxation and wage labor and currency, it meant now that for people to actually be able to pay tax, they had to secure the currency. And in order to secure the currency, they had to engage in wage labor. Now the question is, in this wage labor now, what were Africans made to produce? Very important questions that when you begin to ask, you begin to get the full picture. This wage labor now, remember now that the wage labor involved Africans working or producing cash crops but not food crops. I'm making this statement as cash crops but not food crops to explain that prior to the Europeans coming, Africans were actually engaging in subsistence farming, producing food crops, not cash crops, which meant that Africans were engaging more in subsistence farming, in which they made most of their products to help themselves and then for their own personal consumptions and then little local trade. But with the coming of the white men, now they no longer engaged in the cultivation of food crops, but this time cash crops, which were raw materials that were needed not by Africans but by the Europeans for the European industries. And so now cash crop productions were now introduced. Africans were forced into wage labor to produce these cash crops. These cash crops gave them currency, and this currency was able to help them pay for the taxes of which was imposed on them. And so this is how the Europeans set the structure in such a way that Africans gradually found themselves cultivating cash crops and not food crops, of which were necessary for Africans themselves. And so gradually what happened? Africans who were known to produce fabrics, clothes of which they wore, no longer produce clothes for themselves, because now what happened? The Europeans made them to produce cotton. These cottons were now shipped abroad, manufactured in their industries, and then produced clothes. These clothes were now imported into Africa, and then Africans began to put on European fabrics rather than putting on their own local fabrics of which they were able to make prior to the coming of the Europeans. You get it now? And that is how they actually laid the foundation for a dependent economy, of which is still evident today in Africa. So now if you look at it very well, you can now get the full picture. Now, most people often say that the Europeans, when they came, they created infrastructures like roads and railways. The question that we often ask is this: if the roads and the railways that were created were actually created all over Africa, then yes, we would say yes, the white man meant good for the African man when he created roads and railways. But if you look at the nature of Africa during that period in time, you would realize that the roads and the railways that were being created by the Europeans during colonial era were only roads and railways that were connected from the raw material producing centers to the seaports. The roads and the railways that were created were meant for transporting only raw materials, and so they were only connected from the raw material producing centers to the seaport, which meant that the railways and the roads of which were created were not to serve Africans, but were meant to serve the Europeans, using the Africans to achieve their very goal. So now let me just give you a very quick recap so that you can at least just remember it. Now, I said that this is how the Europeans made Africans dependent on them. They created a system and abolished the existing system in the African continent. First, they abolished or banned the local industries to avoid competition, which meant that the raw materials of which were often exported were used to bring back finished goods, of which they did not want competition from local markets. And so when the white man exported cotton, he made fabrics with it in his own industries and brought it back. And so he was able to sell it to the Africans, and the Africans now would patronize because the industries that once made clothes and fabrics for Africans had already been abolished. So they eliminated any local competition, and so they forced Africans into the production of cash crops and not food crops or any crops of which was more beneficial to Africans prior to their arrival. And so I also said they introduced wage labor. I said they introduced taxation, and so they also introduced the currency. So with the introduction of currency, wage labor, and taxation, Africans found themselves forced to engage in the production and cultivation of cash crops, of which the Europeans now used in making or transforming into raw materials, and they imported back. And so Africans gradually found themselves becoming producers of what they do not consume and consumers of what they do not produce. So now that you understand how Africans became, or how colonialism made Africans dependent on the Europeans, maybe now we can now begin to understand the nature of why Africa is the way it is today. Even today in Africa, it's very evident that 90% of what Africans make use of, they do not actually produce it. And the things that they produce, such as raw materials, they do not actually consume them. The question I'm here to ask is this: if cotton that we produce can actually produce fabrics, why then do we have to export this cotton instead of make use of this cotton, produce fabrics for our own usage, and then also export? Another question is, if the different cocoa that we use is used in producing coffee and tea and other useful materials, why then do we have to import coffee from abroad and they would now produce the cocoa right here? If the diamonds that we export are being used to make jewelries, and then we now have to import these jewelries in very expensive prices, why then do we have to continue to import these things when we can actually convert our own existing diamonds right here and then convert them into jewelries? These questions are only food for thought. I hope now you get the picture of how we got to where we are. So now maybe we can now begin to figure out how we can escape this particular position where we are, because it is very, very disadvantageous and very, very impoverished. Thank you, and that will be all for today.